Hello. Today's lesson is on editing and revising. I realize that the structure of the class being what it is, most of you will not really get to your editing and revising until closer to the end of the semester, but in theory, you want to begin editing and revising your manuscripts as soon as you get your comments back, and so we're going to tackle it here in the logical place rather than in the more practical place where you're actually going to start doing your editing and revising. So I'm just going to quick cover 6 tips, some of which are more complex than others. Keep your audience in mind, learn how to accept criticism, respond to each specific critical comment, read your prose out loud, focus on the paragraph, and revise around key sentences. And I'll take each of these separately. So the first comment is to keep your audience in mind. If you've done your work correctly, you will be more expert on this than your audience will be. And one of the things that you want to do is to write for a particular audience. In this case, you need to balance 2 audiences, and this is going to become even more of an issue when you move it to a presentation. On the one hand, you have a student audience, and your student audience is made up of intelligent, educated people who don't actually necessarily know anything about this particular subject. And in addition, then, you have a professional audience, and this is people who do have a certain amount of expertise in this topic or in some aspect of this topic. Having this kind of a balance is appropriate for a policy analysis simulation because in real life the same thing happens. In any given policy presentation, some of the audience are there for political reasons, and they may have considerable say in the outcomes of what happens to your policy recommendations. And there will be other people who are actual experts and have real knowledge about the topic. And they may, in fact, have less direct impact on whether your policy recommendations are taken. So having both audiences in mind is something that has to happen professionally, not simply in a classroom simulation. Now, I said before when we were talking about writing that writing is rewriting, and it's rewriting to editorial criticism. So an essential part of writing professionally is learning to accept criticism. And almost the only way to do this is to separate yourself from the work. This seems like a no-brainer, but it's actually very hard. I have an enormously difficult time doing it myself. When I get back a good critical review of my work, I tend to throw it into a drawer I read it, and then I throw it in a drawer for 2 weeks before I can take it out again because I have to get over all of my thin-skinned irritation with the criticisms. I actually had a colleague who was just a machine about getting out papers and publishing projects. And one of the things that she taught me was she would put a manuscript into the mail to a publisher. The publisher would send it out for review. The reviews would come in. She would sit down with those reviews the day they came in and sit down with the manuscript and start outlining the changes she was going to make. She would make all of the changes that she needed to make. She would print out the new manuscript, put it in the envelope, and send it back. She did not even think about it as a critique of her ideas or anything else. She thought of it just as part of the writing process. And if you can learn how to do that, you will be way ahead of the game compared to most other people engaged in professional writing work. Perhaps the most difficult lesson to learn about dealing with editorial critique is learning how to respond to each criticism. That is, when you get back a set of critiques, you want to address every single one, but not always necessarily the way your critic suggests. And to understand what I mean, you have to recognize that there are basically 2 kinds of critique. There's the aha critique. This is the kind of critique where as soon as you read it, you think, oh my gosh, yeah, I should have done that. This is going to make the paper so much better. The second kind of critique is what I call the moron critique, and this is where you look at the critique and you say, oh my God, how could this idiot possibly have misunderstood me so badly to have made this kind of critical comment? This person is a complete moron. Everyone loves the aha critique. Aha critiques are extremely useful. They fit into what you already planned to do, and you almost immediately know how to implement them. But you have to also address the other critiques. You need to address them in some way that to ensure that other morons who will also read your paper do not also misread it and misunderstand it in that way. In other words, you need to moron-proof your paper. Now, the important thing about moron-proofing a paper is to understand that you do not have to respond the way your critic wants you to. Just as an example, one time I received back a review of a particular paper in which I had some really interesting gender stuff in the data. And I did not develop it because the paper was focusing on another aspect of the data, and I had only so many thousand words to write the paper in. Well, of course, one of the critiques said I would like to have seen the author develop this gender stuff more, and went on to give an outline of how I might develop it, which would actually have produced a completely different paper than the one that I had written. What I did to deal with it, instead of rewriting the paper to suit her, I rewrote the paper by putting in a footnote at the first place where I start mentioning the gender data. And I put, this raises a number of important gender issues, and I sort of summarized her points in one or two sentences and concluded, unfortunately, this is beyond the scope of this paper. So this is what I mean, where you can address a problem without actually having to respond to it by rewriting the paper or whatever else it is that your critic wants you to do. Okay, point number 4, read your prose out loud. This is a classic technique for dealing with editorial writing. Your overall the best way to test how your paper flows, whether your ideas hang together, and whether the information segments are concise and make the point, or whether they're too long and incoherent and people can't understand them, is to read your prose aloud. Ideally, you should read your prose aloud several times. You should read it aloud to yourself to see if it flows well. You should read it to the other members of your group to see if they pick up on things you missed. And you should read it to any outside readers that you can somehow coerce or seduce into patiently listening to you read it, so that you can find out how outsiders who don't have any information about the topic hear the writing and understand it. Number 5, in doing your rewriting, focus on the paragraph. This parallels my point in telling you how to write them, where I said to focus on the paragraph. And in particular, focus on the specific functions of the paragraph that we talked about in the lesson on writing. To begin with, focus on the key sentence. You should be able to locate the key sentence in every single paragraph, and it should be the basis that the rest of the paragraph is built around. Things that are in the paragraph that don't directly relate to the key sentence perhaps don't need to be in there at all. You want to make sure that the key sentence is fully contextualized. Can people understand it? I've had students write policy analysis where they jump right into their project without stopping to think about how much the outside reader will know. So, for example, one of the groups one year jumped right into the problem of work permits in Syria. And they didn't bother to explain what the hell a work permit was in the Syrian refugee context. And so that context had to be established before they could actually explain the problem that they were going to be writing about. You want to make sure that your paragraph has a sufficient number of examples and illustrations. So having written your key sentence and having contextualized it, Do you give, is it understandable, or do you need to supply examples or illustrations so people will be able to understand what you're talking about? And then when you've given an example or an illustration, do you need to explain the example and illustration and show how it relates to the key sentence and the context? This is usually necessary, even when you think it's not. And this is another way where reading it aloud to an audience can help you discover whether or not you've been sufficiently clear in this area. So revise around your key sentences, and one of the best techniques for doing this is to just make a kind of list of all of the key sentences. One of the things I like to do with some kinds of informative papers, for example, I'm writing an encyclopedia article right now, is to go through and underline all the key sentences and then sort of line them up. And they should collectively be a complete outline of the entire story you're trying to tell in your policy analysis. And that's a nice way to see if things are missing and then fix them up. Hope that helps. Please, as usual, ask yourself the 3 key questions that we ask after each lesson. What was the most interesting thing you got out of this? What is one question that this raised for you that didn't answer? And third, what is one concrete way that this will directly affect the project that you are working on in your task force? And I'll see you in class.